A new course for learning. President Obama signs an education law rewrite, shifting powers to states.
We're not going to rush it. We're going to get it right.
Still no deal. A government shutdown looms as both sides dig in for the battle over the budget. Spiritual shortfall. America's military archdiocese suffers from a critical chaplain shortage. And the so-called cult of Mary. National Geographic explores the Blessed Mother's profound impact throughout history. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, December 10th, 2015. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Sweeping changes today for education in America. Calling the bipartisan bill a Christmas miracle, President Obama signs an overhaul of the No Child Left Behind Act. It changes the approach to teacher accountability and sets new guidelines to improve poorly performing schools. More decision-making powers return to the states. That means the federal government will no longer push academic standards such as Common Core. A little later, we discuss why some Catholic schools think that's good news. There's just one day left for Congress to pass a new budget to fund the government. It's a massive $1.1 trillion spending bill with still unresolved issues. More from Chief White House correspondent and political director Lauren Ashburn. Lauren?
Brian, the current funding expires Friday night at midnight. One of the reasons this bill may not pass has to do with something called riders. They are attachments to the bills that most likely would not pass both houses of Congress.
Senator Cruz is already prepared for a government shutdown on that issue.
Republican candidate Ted Cruz declined to give his thoughts on a shutdown. Others were more vocal on Capitol Hill. Reactions were mixed as to whether certain contentious riders, like funding for Syrian refugees, should be included in the bill sent to the president. All of this confusion points to the likelihood of a missed deadline, something the administration is against.
Congress has a responsibility to pass a budget to keep the government open. They were supposed to meet a September 30th deadline. They did not meet it. The president is not willing to give members of Congress additional weeks or months to negotiate a bipartisan budget agreement.
We have to make sure that how we spend the hardworking taxpayer dollars are done in a way where we are scrutinizing every dollar, and we're not going to rush it. We're going to get it right. And so the deadlines, look, deadlines come and deadlines go.
The president has made it clear that he would only accept a couple of day deadline for procedural matters.
Lauren, what's the over-under on a government shutdown tomorrow?
Well, I've seen anywhere from 25% to 75%, but the White House says that it is optimistic simply because it does not believe that newly elected Speaker Ryan would want a government shutdown on his hands 6 weeks into his tenure. Brian.
Lauren Ashburn at the White House. Thank you, Lauren. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. The House gets a confidential briefing on the San Bernardino terror attack. Syed Farouk and his wife, Tashfeen Malik, are accused of killing 14 people and injuring dozens last week. Jason Calvi caught up with representatives as they left today's briefing, and he joins us tonight.
Brian, we are learning that Farouk and his friend who bought the assault rifles were related through marriage and may have plotted an attack 3 years ago. The wife came to the U.S. on a fiancé visa and discussed jihad and martyrdom as early as 2013. The FBI's closed-door briefing for House members was brief. Arizona Republican Matt Salmon tells me he learned nothing new, nothing that hasn't already been reported in the media about the California shootings. He calls the terror attack an intelligence failure.
We know after the fact that there was radicalization that had occurred, and yet before she even came to the United States, and yet she was still able to slip through the cracks. So the system is not working.
Other representatives tell me it's hard to know who's a threat and who's not. Representative Peter King says he wants greater monitoring of those already in the country.
I believe there should be much more surveillance in the Muslim community here in the United States. The only way you're going to find out this in advance is to do the same type of 24/7 surveillance that was done in the Italian-American communities when they're going after the mob.
Also this week, a bipartisan group of senators introduced a bill that would require social media companies to report any online terrorist activity they find, including planning, recruiting, or sharing terrorist material. Brian?
Jason Calvi, thank you. And a scare today for dozens of Boston commuters. Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker says somebody tampered with a passenger train. It left a suburban station without a conductor. The train swept past 4 other stations before they were able to stop it by shutting off the power to the electrified third rail. No passengers were hurt. Police are investigating tonight. The governor says whoever tampered with that train, quote, knew what they were doing. Swiss police, tipped off by the CIA, fan out across Geneva today, searching for terrorists. Investigators originally thought the suspects were connected with last month's terror attacks in Paris. Now they say they're looking for at least 4 people believed to be plotting new attacks in Geneva. The local terror alert level has been raised. What's being called a giant stride forward in Catholic-Jewish relations. A new document of understanding between the two faith traditions is presented at the Vatican today.
The new document demonstrates giant strides have been made, but we are talking of a dynamic and relentless process. We will never be able to sit back and say, the work is done, the agenda is complete.
This document reaffirms there is much more to do together to address the ills of modern society and combat prejudice and anti-Semitism. Rabbi David Rosen joining us from Rome. Rabbi Rosen is the International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee. Pope Francis has a special relationship with the Jewish community. What does that mean to you personally, Rabbi?
Well, it means a lot in terms of both the personal dynamics. When one encounters Pope Francis, one feels this special warmth of friendship, and it was my privilege again to be able to meet him yesterday. And of course, the world has a particular image and awareness of this Pope, whose interaction is so impactful. I mean, he is the ultimate superstar, and the world knows that he is a great friend of the Jewish people, and therefore the changed relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people gets much broader, wider, universal coverage because of his remarkable appeal.
What is significant about this new document? What changes from Nostra Aetate, which came out at the end of Vatican II?
I suppose what's significant about this document is what it makes explicit, because during the course of these 50 years since Nostra Aetate was promulgated, there have been very significant developments. There have been important statements by individual popes, but to be able to bring it together in a document, a formal document, this is really quite special. And therefore statements like there is no mission to the Jews. Jews are saved if they are true to their own particular covenant and to their observance of Torah, of the Hebrew Bible. That is quite remarkable. And other statements like the rejection of supersessionism, of any replacement by the Church of the Jewish people. This, I think, is the first time that these implicit ideas that have come out of Nostra Aetate have been made explicit in such a document.
And finally, why do you think it's so important that the Catholic faith and the Jewish faith accept and really embrace one another?
Well, I think that's what we are called to do if we affirm a shared text, a shared revelation. With all our differences, we may interpret many aspects of that differently, but we see the Hebrew Bible as God's word. Then we are called to be responsible to it. That has obligations for us not only with regards to one another, but especially to making the world the place that the Hebrew Bible teaches it should be. In other words, a world that is more just, more righteous, more responsive to the dignity of the human person. So we have a responsibility to be loyal to that mandate, and if we share that text, that places a special relationship on us in relation to one another. Pope John Paul II had this beautiful phrase. He had the phrase that as the children of Abraham, we are called to be a blessing to humankind. In order to be so, we must first be a blessing to one another.
Rabbi David Rosen, thank you so much for joining us from Rome tonight.
Thank you.
And returning to our top story, what impact will a major education reform bill signed into law today have on Catholic schools? Dr. Dan Guernsey, Director of K-12 Education Programs from the Cardinal Newman Society, joining us from Ave Maria, Florida by Skype. So with Catholic schools focusing more on heaven than on college, how does Common Core interfere with that spiritual goal?
Common Core is primarily about college and career, and we want to put foremost that it is about complete human formation. That's where effectively functioning, alive human beings make society better, and they certainly grow the church and are the seeds of the gospel. The gospel can take root in those deeply situated lives.
Dan, is this newly signed education law an improvement over what we had?
I think it is. Anytime we can get the federal government to back off even a little bit from education, that is a good thing. Education belongs under the principle of subsidiarity, as close to the parents and the community as possible, so that they're backing off, and especially that they're backing off of testing, is a great news for us.
Isn't it difficult, though, to track the different state standards?
Well, again, why should we? Again, if the federal government doesn't belong in education according to the Constitution, let the states and the local communities take care of themselves. And we're perfectly capable in Florida of taking care of our students. We love them and care about how they do. I'm sure the other states are the same way. So let us free, let us experiment.
Don't Catholic schools take a different approach to standards than the public schools?
Yes, Catholic schools have standards, and we can use some of the public school standards, but our mission, the mission always drives the standards. And because our mission is broader and involves the spiritual, emotional, and moral well-being of our students, we cast our net much broader. And so we don't ever want to narrow our efforts down to just those secular state standards, which, in and of themselves, some are effective, some aren't. But we in Catholic schools know we do a great job. We've got a great history of that.
Dr. Dan Guernsey with the Cardinal Newman Society, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Coming up, has Europe set itself up for religious-inspired terrorism by abandoning its own Christian roots? And our fighting forces need more priests to serve their spiritual needs around the world.
Ci chiede soltanto le nostre miserie.
The Holy Father in today's homily saying God is merciful. He gave us everything. He only asks for our miseries. Meanwhile, experts gather this week in Rome to discuss the Christian response to persecution. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Paul Botti joins us from Rome. He's the advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan for Minority Affairs and chairs the Shahbaz Botti Memorial Trust. Paul, your brother, Shahbaz, a Catholic, once expressed his willingness to sacrifice his own life as a humble servant of Jesus. Do you think that's what happened to him when he was assassinated in 2011?
Yeah, Shahbaz, struggled for all his life. He dedicated 28 years of his life to protect religious minorities in Pakistan. Actually, he has been promoting the religious freedom according to our faith, which is to protect all people, all religious believers. It's not for only Christians. So he had been promoting this ideology in Pakistan where 95% people are Muslim and a small group who want to impose the Sharia law, the radical philosophy in Pakistan. So his ideology was according to the teaching of gospel, which is to respect and protect all people from different faiths.
And many of them see him as a martyr for religious liberty. You got to meet with Pope Francis a few years back. What did you talk about, and what do you think of his commitment to religious freedom around the world?
I think his religious commitment is great, and I spoke in the St. Peter's Square long time ago, and he asked me to express what I think about religious freedom, what was the witness of my brother, and for which he has been given his life for this struggle against all kind of discrimination and injustice based on religious belief. So he is committed, and that time in the public in St. Peter's Square, where there were more than 80,000 people, he expressed his great concern about this, and he said that we are with you. So I think he is very determined and very much, convinced that religious freedom is a cause which is problem of today.
Well, thank you for sharing the continued work of your brother by chairing the Shahbaz Botti Memorial Trust. Paul Botti, our prayers are with you, and we thank you for joining us from Rome tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, bye.
And a new article questions the future of Europe. It says Europe is straying too far from its Judeo-Christian roots and facing increased religiously inspired violence. Dr. Samuel Gregg, research director at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, calls it the end of Europe. He cites financial problems in large and small countries and an influx of migrants and the gap between the Islamic religion and Western culture. Dr. Gregg writes, Europe's moral and cultural hollowing out will continue amidst an Indian summer of managed decline and self-loathing. Dr. Gregg is Skyping with us from Grand Rapids, Michigan. What do you think these terror attacks say about today's Europe?
Well, I think it tells us many things, but perhaps the biggest thing it tells us is that Europe is struggling with the issue of religion. Islam is present in many European countries. It has many different forms. It includes some radical forms, as we have seen from these terrorist incidents. But it seems to me that the primary question that Europeans have, that the Islam issue and the terrorism issue raises, is how do Europeans deal with this issue of religion when they are A, often in denial of their own religious heritage, or B, they reduce Christianity to this type of sentimental humanitarianism. In other words, they're not taking religion seriously in the way that they ought to if they're going to deal with this issue of jihadism.
Sam, you and many others link the refugee crisis in Europe to this terrorism and the terrorist acts that we've seen. That may be true, but how do you be welcoming as Christians to people who need refuge and get around, address this other issue as well?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is, yes, we must be welcoming to the stranger in our midst. But the stranger in our midst also needs to know that there are laws that they're supposed to abide by, and that there is a culture into which, I think in Europe's case, they need to be more insistent upon this issue of assimilation rather than multiculturalism. Multiculturalism clearly isn't working. It's ghettoizing large segments of Europe's population. And it seems to me that assimilation and immigration is the way that you go ahead. You cannot have immigration, I think, without assimilation. The two must go hand in hand.
So is Europe lost, or is there anything that can be done to escape this decline?
I think Europe, if it's going to recover from political decline, increasing global irrelevance, and obviously their major economic and religious problems, I think part of the issue is going back to the roots of Europe, as people like John Paul II and Benedict XVI have said, because you can't deal with the issue of immigration or even the issue of assimilation unless it's very clear about what everyone is supposed to assimilate to. That doesn't mean everyone has to become a believing Christian or a believing Jew, but it does mean that everyone needs to be cognizant of the cultural history of these countries and not in denial of it, let alone ashamed of it.
Deep and significant insight from Dr. Samuel Gregg with the Acton Institute. Thank you, Dr. Gregg.
Thank you, Brian.
The Senate Judiciary Committee rebukes Donald Trump today by a 16-4 vote. It endorses a non-binding amendment that says barring individuals from entering the U.S. based on religion would be un-American. Well, a shortage of priests to serve as military chaplains grows critical. The need is so great right now, bishops are asking to consider giving up priests from their own dioceses. Wyatt Goolsby is here with more.
Brian, picture this. 1/4 of military personnel and their families, about 1 million people, are Catholic, but there are only about 217 full-time priests to serve them. The shortage is so bad, the archbishop in charge is looking for other ways to fill the void.
It's a huge hole that needs, obviously, to be filled.
For the last 8 years, Father Michael Bryant has celebrated Mass at Washington's Navy Yard. The 75-year-old Navy vet says he feels blessed to serve the military, but this is not his full-time job.
My full-time ministry is with the Archdiocese of Washington and prison ministry there.
Father Bryant is contracted by the Navy because there are not enough priests to be full-time military chaplains.
The presence of priests has dwindled to the point of being desperate.
Archbishop Timothy Broglio pleaded for more priests at the U.S. Bishops' Conference this year. He's the head of the Archdiocese for Military Services. It serves United States military personnel and their families all over the world. In most cases, other bishops must voluntarily give up priests in order to become full-time military chaplains.
Bishops obviously become reluctant to let go of priests for the military when they can't even fill, a lot of times, the parish assignments in their own diocese.
So military branches and the archdiocese turn to contractors, many of whom are older and closer to retirement. Commander Juan Rodarte has served as an engineer in Japan and Saudi Arabia. In Japan, he had a priest on base, but in Saudi Arabia, there was no priest, and it was against the law to practice his faith openly, even on a U.S. base. Here he can, and he says it's a blessing.
We all go through our own trials and tribulations in life, and it's kind of nice to have that getaway to talk to that particular person, that chaplain, that priest.
Father Bryant says his ministry to the military enriches his life as a priest.
The Archdiocese for Military Services is encouraging priests to consider becoming a military chaplain. In October, the Archdiocese hosted its first ever discernment retreat, specifically to educate clergy members and to pray for vocations. Brian.
Thank you, Wyatt. Another reason to pray for vocations to the priesthood. Up next, a courtroom tirade from the man accused of killing 3 people at Planned Parenthood of the Rockies. And a new documentary produced for secular cable TV explores devotion to Mary over the centuries. On this 10th of December, we celebrate Our Lady of Loreto. The House of Loreto is where Mary was born and grew up. Legend says it was moved to Loreto, Italy by angels. Thanks for joining us this Thursday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Robert Deere calls himself a warrior for the babies as pro-life groups distance themselves from the accused Planned Parenthood shooter. Defense attorneys question if Deere is even competent to stand trial. He kept interrupting them yesterday during a court hearing. Prosecutors say Deere shot and killed 3 people at the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs. Mallory Quigley is with Susan B. Anthony List. And Mallory, how does this man claiming to be a warrior for babies clearly defy what it means to be pro-life?
Well, the Right to Life movement is the ultimate nonviolent movement. Brian, abortion is a violent act. It pits a mother against a child. It violates that sacred relationship. That cannot be healed through violence. And, you know, I think we take a look at this horrible, horrible tragedy in Colorado and we look at the people that were involved. The person that really embodies the pro-life spirit in the whole story is that officer, Garrett Swayze, who laid down his life for the people inside that clinic to preserve their lives. And we know he was a pastor. He certainly didn't agree with what Planned Parenthood does, but he sought to preserve life.
So what is the next step in the effort to defund Planned Parenthood?
Well, we did have a great victory last week when the Senate voted in favor. They passed a reconciliation bill that defunds Planned Parenthood, reroutes those taxpayer dollars to comprehensive health care clinics where women and girls can get real whole woman care. The Senate actually strengthened that bill, so it's got to go back to the House before it gets to President Obama's desk, but it will get there. And he will veto it. But this hasn't all been for show. The whole fight over reconciliation and defunding Planned Parenthood, it's opened up the public's eyes. It's drawn more attention to those horrific videos that came out this summer. And it sets a precedent for when we have a pro-life president, hopefully in 2017.
Thank you for the great update, Mallory, from Susan B. Anthony List. We appreciate you. And a popular cable TV network calls Mary the most powerful woman in the world. Catherine Szeltner brings us that story.
From Lourdes to Fatima to household shrines, National Geographic sees Marian devotion as a global phenomenon.
There have been claims of apparitions of Jesus and of the saints, but by far there are many more apparitions of the Virgin Mary.
The Cult of Mary special airs on the cable network this Sunday, focusing on Catholic devotion to the Mother of God. It follows National Geographic's November print feature, How the Virgin Mary Became the World's Most Powerful Woman, which includes a map of the thousands of reported Marian apparitions. Author Maureen Orth met with people claiming to have seen Mary.
They all describe this woman with this incredible voice and this incredible beauty. And one of them in Medjugorje even said to her, "Why are you so beautiful?" And she said, "It's my love that makes me beautiful."
Marian expert Michael O'Neill was featured in both the print and TV special. He tells EWTN News Nightly, devotion to Mary is everywhere.
When you look at nature, for example, you look at the Virgin Mary being pervasive even in things like the rosemary bush or in the ladybug, or in culture, you have pop culture things like the Hail Mary pass.
That's why he says National Geographic is paying attention to Our Lady.
They're not making any judgments whether apparitions are real or are false. They're not talking about Marian devotion, whether it's good or it's bad. They're just presenting what a huge role the Virgin Mary plays in the life of the faithful.
While there are thousands of Marian apparition reports, the Church only recognizes 16 of them. Michael O'Neill says apparitions aren't necessary for our faith, but they can guide us to Christ. Brian.
Thank you, Catherine, as we say goodnight with the beautiful Christmas decorations at the U.S. Capitol. God bless you.